possibility of parliamentarians playing
things there.
From Kyoto News, and on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, we'd like to thank you all for being here for this very timely and relevant panel discussion. And briefly, I will just introduce everybody and ask that we're very interested, given the launch of the ICBM over the weekend, if you could also touch upon that. I know that's of interest to many of us. And I believe Mr. Bill Kidd will be starting out today. And he's a member of the Scottish Parliament. And then Commander Rob Greene will be speaking. He used to be with the British Royal Navy. And then Alan Weir is a global coordinator of Parliamentarians for Non-Nuclear Proliferation and Disarmament. And last is Jonathan Branoff, President, Global Security Institute.
realistic this is, given the current political.
Good turnout here, I'm very pleased to say. And everyone, of course, be aware that the UK, as a nuclear weapon state, has joined together with the other P5 nuclear weapon states to boycott these treaty negotiations. Effectively, non-attendance can be seen as boycotting. However, as all of the UK's nuclear arsenal is based in Scotland, against the wishes of the Scottish Government, the votes of the Scottish Parliament and the expressed will of the Scottish people, it is the case that I, as a member of the Scottish Parliament, along with a range of Scottish civil society representatives, are at this conference event to speak up on behalf of our nation. As a co-president of PNND, I support the calls to reduce nuclear threats, phase out nuclear arsenals as quickly and safely as possible by prohibiting nuclear weapons, and thereby achieve the peace and security of a nuclear weapon-free world. The Parliamentary Action Plan, which you will have in your packs, the Parliamentary Action Plan for a Nuclear Weapon-Free World has been produced by PNND in conjunction with the IPU, and it looks to take the next practical steps following on from this UN treaty conference. The next major step outlined will be to take forward the opportunities provided by the 2018 UN High-Level Conference on Nuclear Disarmament. And along with my colleagues and everyone here, I will be looking for a substantial success in achieving a prohibition treaty this week, which we must then use to promote all countries to sign and ratify. Parliamentarians across the world must ensure that, as the representatives of the peoples of all nations, they are at the forefront of the highest level discussions on effective nuclear disarmament. I am honoured to say that I have a statement from the First Minister of Scotland and her government to present to Her Excellency Ambassador White Gomez as President of the conference, wishing her and all states delegates great goodwill for a successful conclusion in establishing a procedure leading to a world without nuclear weapons. And in the words of my countryman, Sir Walter Scott, we must dare to say and have the soul to believe. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very grateful that you're here today, because what we have to do is make sure that the news about campaigning and working in concert with one another to get rid of nuclear weapons and to have a nuclear weapons-free world is very important. It gets out there amongst the peoples of the world. And I'm afraid that there has been concerted efforts by many in governments in order to keep people in the dark about the dangers of nuclear weapons. We have nuclear weapons in Scotland against our will, but we are intending to have those removed as quickly and safely as possible when we have the powers to do so. I hope that you'll find what we've got to say in the question and answer session interesting, but first and foremost, may I introduce my colleague, Rob Greene.
Thank you, Bill. Yes, I am someone who has been through the experience of being indoctrinated into the dogma of nuclear deterrence, and I did this as part of my experience of being in the British Navy for 20 years, from 1962 to 82. I started by flying as a navigator in the back seat of Buccaneer nuclear strike jets, and my pilot and I were given a target in Russia, which was a military airbase on the outskirts of Leningrad. And then I switched to anti-submarine helicopters, where I was given a nuclear depth bomb because the latest Soviet nuclear submarines went too fast for our lightweight torpedoes to catch them. And so I discovered, to my great concern, that if I ever had to drop one of these nuclear depth bombs, it would be a suicide mission, because in a helicopter you cannot escape from the detonation of a nuclear bomb quickly enough, whereas I could in a nuclear strike jet. And that began to make me doubt my leaders for the first time. I then went on to go into naval intelligence in my last job as a commander, and I found myself caught up in the Falklands War, 1982, which was a very disturbing experience because it was a very close-run thing. We lost ships, and there was a prospect of even being defeated. And of course, my Prime Minister had nuclear weapons. And there was the real danger that in the event of impending defeat, Mrs. Thatcher would have been tempted to use nuclear weapons in order to save the situation. And so that made me really think very hard after I left the Navy. And I've now broken out, and I now understand that nuclear deterrence is in fact what I would call a confidence trick. And I'm happy to take questions about that. But I also would like to finish by saying that I am so proud to be sitting beside Bill Kidd, who is representing the Scottish Government and people who have stood up and who know from the front line what it's like to have to host nuclear weapons against their will. And I see this ban treaty as being a very powerful new tool in order to stigmatize nuclear weapons such that my current colleagues who have to operate these appalling terror devices on behalf of the British political leadership will have to think twice about obeying the orders. Thank you.
So I work for our co-presidents, of which Bill Kidd is one of 12 co-presidents, our council of another 40 parliamentarians from around the world, and a membership of 700 parliamentarians. So we're launching today the Parliamentary Action Plan for a Nuclear Weapons-Free World, which has been about a year in development through our membership in consultation with the Interparliamentary Union and also with some of the key members of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. We're launching it here because it is related to the topic of the Nuclear Ban Treaty, but it goes beyond the Ban Treaty. As you know, the Ban Treaty includes mostly non-nuclear states with one allied state negotiating, and the nuclear armed states and the rest of their allies are not engaged in this. Our members are from the range of states, and we want to see what role the different countries can play to lower the role of nuclear weapons, reduce nuclear weapons risks, and achieve a nuclear weapons-free world. So we have, in your package is just a summary of the Parliamentary Action Plan. The full plan will be on our website later on today. I'll just touch on a couple of aspects of it. One of those is nuclear risk reduction, which is a very important area to work on. You may recall that earlier this year, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists set the doomsday clock at 2.5 minutes to midnight because of the risks of a nuclear exchange happening by accident or miscalculation or even intent. So that's a key area that our parliamentarians are working on to try and encourage governments to lower nuclear threat postures, to lower the operational readiness to use nuclear weapons, because that is one of the factors that's contributing to high risks, and to work with interparliamentary bodies. So I'll be over in the Minsk later this week for the Parliamentary Assembly of the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is taking action on this, and that brings in parliaments, of course, for nuclear armed states, UK, France, Russia and the United States. So there's a good basis working with the parliamentarians of those countries. We're also focusing very much on the 2018 UN High-Level Conference on Nuclear Disarmament as a way of elevating these issues, building public and political attention to them, and hoping that governments might be able to take more measures. So that's an area that we've been working on, we understand yet that there's no agenda that's been set finally for that. So these issues which are in the Parliamentary Action Plan, we hope will form part of the agenda of the 2018 High-Level Conference. We're also working on regional measures such as nuclear weapon-free zones. The Middle East is a very important one. It's very important for the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But yesterday's event also highlights the importance of nuclear risk reduction and building cooperative security in Northeast Asia. And our network of parliamentarians is working on a plan for a Northeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone. It's called the 3+3 proposal, which was put forward by a former foreign minister, Katsuya Okada, and has got cross-party support in the parliaments of Japan and South Korea. And we've also had dialogue with North Korean parliamentary delegations and with governments. So that's something which is very interesting to us as a possible way out of this very tense and threatening, risky situation at the moment. And finally, the other point I want to mention is the financing of nuclear weapons. $100 billion a year is the budget. And many of the corporations involved in this are very powerful lobbying forces. And in order to reverse the nuclear arms race, we're needing to address conversion, etc. So we're working in cooperation with International Peace Bureau, World Future Council and others on a project, Move the Nuclear Weapons Money, which is looking at how to reduce nuclear weapons budgets and reorient those funds into sustainable development goals and other areas of economic and social need. And this ban treaty, which we expect will be adopted on Friday, gives some support for this, because there is a clause which we expect will stay in the treaty that will prohibit states parties from aiding, inducing and encouraging any activities with regards to the production of nuclear weapons. And many of these countries have public funds that are investing in some of these corporations. So we are working on a divestment campaign. We've already had success in some countries, including my own, New Zealand, and there's a lot more in the book if you want more information on the nuclear divestment campaign. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Granoff. I'm the president of the Global Security Institute, and I'm also the ambassador for peace, security, and nuclear disarmament of the Parliament of the World Religions, which is one of the world's largest interfaith organizations. I'm also in a group with the United Religions Initiative, which is another large interfaith organization. And the working group that I'm with in that organization includes former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Secretary of Defense of the United States William Perry, Ambassador Thomas Graham, Ambassador James Goodby, people long associated with Realpolitik. And I highlight this dimension of the issue because in your packet you'll find a joint statement of parliamentarians and religious leaders highlighting the moral issue of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are not just an unacceptable risk to our very survival, they undermine the very values that make us human. Let me just highlight how absurd the situation is. We are willing to put at risk all of the entire future of humanity for our generation's interest. And daily, this risk continues. There are over 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world today. If less than 1% of those were exploded, it would so dramatically affect the climate of the planet that agriculture, as we know it, would become dysfunctional. Billions of people would starve within the next few years, and the remainder would probably not want to live in the chaos that would ensue. This hazardous risk is unworthy of civilization. Let me quote from the statement of these distinguished leaders of Realpolitik. We believe that the indiscriminate destructive effects of nuclear weapons render them incompatible with civilized values and international humanitarian law. The threat to use them and annihilate vast numbers of innocent people, inflict indescribable suffering and environmental destruction is immoral and contrary to the purposes for which the blessings of life have been given to us. Imagine if the Biological Weapons Convention said, no country can use the plague or smallpox as a weapon, but we will let 9 countries use polio as a weapon. We would say that's patently absurd, unsustainable, and immoral. But we know that nuclear weapons are far more dangerous than the plague or smallpox or polio. And yet, the status quo is exactly that immoral, unsustainable, illogical situation. For countries to come together and step forward and say, it's time to move this issue, the logjam, the status quo is unacceptable, is an endeavor that should be supported. But let's be very clear. Nuclear weapons are a global threat. Nuclear weapons' highest cost is not just undermining the moral fabric of modern civilization, but the opportunity cost of nuclear weapons is immeasurable. We must cooperate to protect the climate, to protect the oceans, to protect our rainforest. And while countries threaten to annihilate each other in an afternoon, and make no doubt about it, deterrence is based on the preparedness to do just that. That level of cooperation is unlikely to be achieved. And without that cooperation and our shared real existential threats, we sit at the precipice of destroying everything that matters. So, to the extent that this treaty can be used to highlight the crisis of this moment of civilization, it has great value. But it is not enough. Religious leaders, political leaders, and citizens have to see this as a personal issue, because indeed it is a personal issue. It threatens every single person on the planet. And the daily acceptance of this risk by silence is complicity. So this is a clarion call from parliamentarians, from religious leaders, and now from over 120 countries gathered together to call for the elimination of this irrational, immoral, uncivilized threat. Thank you. It might be a step in that direction, but ultimately that is what's necessary.
Yeah. With regards to paying attention to Israel, what it is paid attention to, it's a very important part of the negotiations in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The 1995, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was extended indefinitely, but part of that was a decision to work for a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, and it's raised in each NPT review conference, so there is some attention being paid to it.
If I could just add, the reason was the first Gulf War, and that was when the possibility of Israel using its nuclear weapons, but following a chemical-headed Scud attack by Saddam Hussein of Iraq, who felt threatened with regime change. And I actually spoke out because I was so concerned that that could happen. But you may not remember, I've actually written about this in my book, 2010, which is my confessional, that basically when the Scud attacks first started, and that was a very serious crisis for Israel's nuclear deterrence policy, because Israelis were cowering in basements, in gas masks. Their nuclear deterrent had failed. And the prospect was that Israel was going to have to use its nuclear deterrent, so-called. And what happened? They wheeled out the nuclear missiles so that the Americans could see that they were ready to go, and they were pointed against Iraq. And the result was panic in Washington, and Bush rushed to give Shamir whatever he needed with mutual aid and Patriot missiles, and to congratulate them for their restraint. That meant that the only value of Israel's nuclear weapons was to coerce the United States into doing what Israel wanted. And I believe that is the only value of Israel's nuclear weapons at the moment.
War III or Ukraine. Without the nuclear deterrence, probably we would have seen more bigger wars. What do you say about this argument?
Rob, do you want to take that one? You wrote the book about it.
Yeah, my response is in this book, but and it's far too long, but it's a complicated story. But what I actually do believe is that nuclear deterrence has nothing to do with security. It promotes hostility, mistrust, insecurity, and proliferation. I have a whole chapter in here which discusses Israel, India, and Pakistan. 3 case studies of how nuclear deterrence drove those 3 countries to get nuclear weapons, and they're stuck on the petard of nuclear deterrence. And I'm afraid it's just a hoax. And so we need to get away from this attempt to justify nuclear deterrence by saying that it's prevented war. That is unprovable, and I think there's plenty of reasons to and arguments to make that Russia would never have attacked Europe. They were just wanting to protect themselves from further invasion, and so they wanted a buffer zone. But that will be my immediate answer. And please read my book.